Will any state in Western history ever compare to the Roman Empire? It controlled a full quarter of mankind, and ruled areas stretching from Britain to Libya and from Spain to Iraq. It dominated its region of the world for over 500 years, and its empire was seen as a high watermark of architecture, administration, cleanliness, and peace. But the empire did fall, and did so spectacularly. The Western Empire fell in a series of barbarian invasions, finally being done apart in 476 AD. The Eastern Empire was slowly torn apart until it was destroyed 1,000 years later, in 1453 AD. But what if this never happened? What if the Roman Empire never fell, remaining the dominant force in the region until the present? How would that affect history, culture, borders, and wars until the present? That is the question of this alternate history. Before we start, this video, like all my videos, will engender quite a bit of argument and discussion. These comment sections are always horrifying wars. But if you like debating alternate history questions, as I know all of you do, then I have the best game for you. I'm proud to be sponsored by the first alternate history card game ever, Forks in the Timeline, a card game where you can open doors to different timelines in the multiverse and argue about the results. I've played it multiple times and can safely say it's a lot of fun. You get a card and a question like, in a timeline where the Nazis had won World War II, what secret cult would you have started? Or in a timeline in which everyone was communist, what would America's favorite food be? The person who makes the best argument wins. You can play it up funnily, logically, seriously, or whimsically, with over 100 different realities and 100 different questions, including the one that this scenario is based off. There's so many different ways to go. Click on the link in the description and use the promo code WHATIF to order now. The primary example that's instructive to look at for what if the Roman Empire survived is China. So every world civilization has a foundational empire, the old empire that united their civilization in the first place, and they look back on as their parent. In India, it's the Mauryaans. For Islam, it's the Umayyads and Abbasids. For Persia, it's the Achaemenids. And for Europe, it's the Roman Empire. However, what all these empires have in common is that they fell apart. The one exception is China. China has endured countless foreign invasions and humiliations, changes in technology and internal divisions, yet remains at heart the same culture as 1,000 years before the birth of Christ. This is for very complex reasons that I'll probably get into in a future video, but the best analog for a Mediterranean which the Romans survived would be China. As the video progresses, we'll continually reference China's history and culture as a guide. So, why did the Roman Empire fall? Although I could write a 400-page book on this subject, the easy answer is a vicious cycle that started with a lack of legitimacy in the government. We tend to view the Roman Empire as a hereditary monarchy. That isn't entirely accurate. The Roman emperors did everything they could to not be described as a monarchy. They never used the Latin term rex or king due to bad insinuations, instead using imperator, meaning he who gives orders, princeps or first citizen, or Augustus or honored one. Rome wasn't a monarchy, it was much closer to a fascist dictatorship. Say what you want about monarchies, but the stable and clear succession line means that there doesn't have to be civil wars when one king succeeds another, which is very good from the perspective of stability. Rome never had this stability and never had a guaranteed line of succession. It worked out as long as the army was honest, but once the army became dominated by internal barbarians from areas like Gaul or the Balkans that didn't care at the Roman institutions themselves, and the tribesmen who were part of the army just supporting their generals out of pay, then the empire collapsed into civil war upon civil war, dominating the empire for 150 years. After this, Rome deviated too far into the other extreme. The emperors Diocletian and Constantine were able to reform the empire by turning it effectively into an authoritarian, militaristic command economy. This kept the empire going for another 100 years, but was a deeply flawed model that ended up collapsing. Although Rome faced enormous issues, including improving technology among barbarian peoples, the Hunnish invasions, climate change, and plagues, a Rome with quality leadership would have been able to face them. If the Roman Empire could have reformed, while it still had some energy, they could have dealt with these issues and survived. In this timeline, that occurs in 238 AD during the Roman Civil War that was occurring in that era. The emperor was technically Maximinus Thrax, who was a Balkan military thug that had seized the throne, and the Italian nobility had grown tired of this, recreated the Senate, appointing universally respected aristocrats named Balbinus and Pupienus. They actually defeated Maximinus, but were both killed by the Imperial Praetorian Guard. In this timeline, Balbinus and Pupienus purged the Praetorian Guard, and the Italian aristocracy seizes power over the country. This timeline isn't dependent upon these two gentlemen being geniuses. I see little evidence of that. However, it is dependent on the aristocratic guy pulling the strings behind this being one. He sets up the Senate as the dominant form of government, and Rome becomes an aristocratic republic like it was earlier in Great Britain. After centuries of rule by military dictators, Rome reverts back to aristocratic control. There might be an emperor, but he would still be a figurehead. This would allow a stable transfer of power from regime to regime. The big reason the Roman Empire fell was from 180 to 330, it was a chaotic, bloody mess that resulted in a third of the population dying. To keep the Roman Empire functioning, various measures like hyperinflating the currency, overtaxation, hiring of barbarians to support the military, creation of a brutal command economy, overexpansion of the bureaucracy, and creating a veritable caste system resulted in a demographic and economic stagnation that meant that Rome couldn't sustain a military that could hold off the barbarians. This never happens in this timeline. Rather than the internal barbarian generals from areas like the Balkans or Gaul continually seizing power, who didn't give a whit over the functioning of the empire, the old Roman aristocracy stays in power. The old Roman aristocracy wasn't perfect and had a lot of systemic issues, but it had managed the empire successfully for hundreds of years. One of the most important elements of this timeline that I don't know how to pull off is never having the Roman aristocracy become pacified and replaced by first internal barbarians and then Germanic ones. Rather than becoming a parasitic landowning class, the Roman nobility remained active in war and politics. With a centralized, controlled form of leadership, Rome would be able to deal with the foreign invasions and not have a completely destroyed society. The crisis of the 3rd century, or the violence that stretched between 180 and 330, destroyed much of the European section of the empire, and without that pulling them down, the Roman Empire could have survived. The main force that resulted in the fall of Rome in our timeline was the Hunnish invasions. The new Rome built by Diocletian and Constantine had been capable of holding the frontier pretty well until the Huns from Central Asia smashed into Central Europe. This resulted in a unified chain reaction of Germanic barbarian peoples striking into the empire at once, which destroyed it. In this timeline, a more effectively run Rome, a Rome which is still capable of raising armies, is able to effectively mobilize its population of 70 million to raise army after army to hold off the barbarians, using some as mercenaries, but later assimilating them. The Huns are smashed in the Balkans somewhere, and the unified empire survives. The political effects of this timeline get very difficult to predict past a certain range, since we've just changed several centuries of Roman history. However, it is easy to see how several long-term trends would develop. Something minor that still gets to me is that when people in alternate history tend to envision a world in which the Roman Empire never fell, they almost always show it like the Roman Empire around the birth of Christ with more advanced technology. This isn't true. The empire kept going for at least another 500 years, and by the time Rome fell in 476, it was a completely different state. Pants had replaced togas, gladiatorial games and slavery were definitely on the way out, and no one prayed to Jupiter anymore. The best way to envision this timeline's Roman civilization, and this is an oversimplification, is as a huge Byzantine empire. Unless you're one of the die-hard Byzantine fanboy crew, it's not as sexy. A big notion that dominates a lot of this video that many of you won't agree with is that the Roman Empire wasn't a part of Western civilization. We get this notion from the Whig theory of history, that our civilization started in Egypt and continually advanced through Greece, Rome, etc. to get to the present Anglo-Saxon nations. The more you spend with the ancient world, however, the more you realize it's not just a foreign country, but an entirely different continent. One of the things I find very telling is that I was just reading a social history of the late Roman Empire, and one of the things that came up was that the Romans had all sorts of intellectual and social concepts that were just completely alien to our current Western worldview. That's not the case for the Middle Ages, where, even if we look down on them, they view the world through a lens that we understand. Something that really struck me was that I heard a lot of these Roman concepts before, just coming from modern China. The modern Western civilization we have has grown out of the combination of the Catholic Church and the barbarian kingdoms, both heirs to Rome in their own way, and neither would exist in this world. Catholicism's relationship with the state is really weird and one of a kind in history. In most states in history, the church either dominated everything or is a stooge of the government. Catholicism's relationship was strange in that after the fall of Rome, there was no political force that was capable of conquering central Italy and crushing the Pope. But the Pope had practically no real political power in a continent of warrior nobilities, and so a delicate balance of power came to exist between the church and lay authorities, which competed for centuries. This allowed the creation of the separation of church and state that only really exists in the West. In China, the state is the representation of the divine will. In India, the clergy ran everything. In Orthodox civilization, the church was a stooge of the state, and in Islam, the religious and political leader were one and the same. In this timeline, the Catholic Church developed like the Orthodox Church in the Byzantine or Russian empires, completely controlled by political forces it was part of. This would basically make all of Christianity pretty similar to our timeline's Orthodox Church structure. The reason that the Roman Empire's social and intellectual relations reminded me of China was that both states are pretty similar. In large, centralized empires with pretty similar climates, similar conditions appear. In both imperial Roman and Chinese society, position and hierarchy was more important than individualism. Ability to network people's skills and show deference to social superiors was seen as one of the most important traits to have. Wisdom and learning were highly respected, although there was no expectation of technological or personal gain involved, and the ideal society was based around each class in the hierarchy behaving in their socially prescribed manner. The main distinguishing features of Western civilization were created since, unlike most other civilizations, after the fall of Rome, no centralized authority replaced it. Rather than another empire forming soon afterwards, Western Europe collapsed into tiny states that were incapable of holding power. This resulted in the church and the warrior elite gaining greater power over society. The most definitive traits of Western civilization developed due to the collapse of central authority. The emphasis on individualism comes out of a combination of Christianity becoming a dominant force in society and being able to assert itself over the late Roman hierarchy. Late Roman Christianity was very collectivist, but with the fall of Rome and the collapse of broader social systems, Christianity took a more individualist direction. This also became mixed with the Germanic notion of Freiheit, in which a man was entitled to certain rights due to being part of the warband and born free. This is the start of our current word and idea, freedom. Similarly, the West is really interesting in being predominantly a guilt-based culture, in which individual action is driven by personal guilt, rather than most of Asia, which is honor and shame-based. This also took place due to Christianity replacing the late Roman social system that was shame-based. As we're going to see, this timeline's Roman Empire would be strikingly similar to Confucian China, a learned aristocracy running the government, with a muzzled collectivist religion, a wealthy capitalist economy, under control of the state, and a largely peaceful, homogeneous, and stable internal population. It goes without saying that the Mediterranean and European world would have a much greater degree of homogeneity than it did in our timeline. Nations like Spain, France, Italy, Turkey, etc. would not exist, as those nations formed in the ashes of the Roman Empire. Instead, the vast majority of the citizens of the empire would view themselves as Romanitas, or Roman, although in reality there would be a large division between the Latin-speaking western part of the empire and the Greek east. There would also be many ethnic minorities like the Basques, some Slavs, and Berbers. The Roman Empire would likely survive within these boundaries. A mistake a lot of alternate historians make is they think a single empire can survive with the same borders for thousands of years. This isn't true. Barbarian invasions, internal civil wars, governmental collapses happen with pretty regular frequency, but in the long run, if the borders make sense geographically, the nation can survive. Keep in mind that the Greek and Latin sections of the empire would likely divide and reunite several times. The reason that the Roman Empire made sense in the first place was since naval travel was far easier in this era than land, and most of the population centers of the empire hugged the Mediterranean. The empire was also dependent on growing olive oil and wine. Thus, the parts of the empire that were north of the Mediterranean and olive wine country would gradually be whittled away from the empire over the centuries. Germanic barbarians would still take the north of France, England, the Rhineland, and Austria from the empire. Something very important that people rarely draw attention to is that before the fall of Rome, the Balkans were densely settled by the Thracians and Illyrians, or relatives of the modern-day Albanians. Both of these were good warrior peoples and made up the backbone of the Roman army, supplying the empire with some very good emperors. However, Attila the Hun committed genocide against the Illyrians, thus denuding the region of population and opening up space for the Slavs to settle the region. In this timeline, with Roman leadership capable of stopping the Huns, that never happens. The Balkan peoples survive and thrive. There's actually a fair chance that either of these, gaining more and more power inside the empire, would split off as independent nations, while the empire would be going through a weak phase. We would see the Balkans in this timeline being unified military forces equal to the nations of Western Europe in our timeline, like England, France, or Spain. For alternate histories that go on for hundreds or thousands of years, the butterfly effect is really difficult to figure out. For those of you that don't know, the butterfly effect is the idea that one slight change derails the rest of an alternate history in ways we can't imagine, since everything's interconnected. You always wonder that if a person was removed from existence, did the conditions of that era mean that someone very similar would have just taken their place? This is where I come to Muhammad. Several hundred years of changes means that Muhammad himself would likely never be born. However, would something similar to Islam have developed anyway? It's hard to say, but I'm going to say no. Axial Age, or generally monotheistic Iron Age religions, universally displaced the previous polytheistic ones. But that had already happened in the Near East between Christianity and Zoroastrianism. Although there were long-term reasons Islam succeeded on such a massive level, I'm going to make the call that the timing for Islam was perfect, striking when the Byzantine and Persian empires were very weak, and thus if conditions had changed slightly, it never would have existed. Having Islam never exist opens up a whole new can of worms that would double the length of this video. However, I've already made a video on this, so click on the link in the description for what if Islam never existed. Having Islam never exist would result in a lot of shifts to European civilization. Firstly, one of the most important side effects of Islam was splitting the Mediterranean. Dividing the Mediterranean north-south had several important effects, the first of which was that North Africa had thrived during the Roman Empire, becoming one of the richest provinces in the empire due to trade with the northern side of the Mediterranean, which has consistently had double the population by selling its agricultural produce to the great cities of the northern Mediterranean. With the Mediterranean split, North Africa became significantly poorer. This would never happen in this timeline. North Africa would remain super wealthy, in fact one of the wealthiest regions in the world, with Carthage being one of the largest cities on the planet. Another important shift was when the Mediterranean split, the center of European civilization moved from the Mediterranean to Northern Europe. Northern Europe still wouldn't be poor in this timeline. The soil is better than the south, but with the Mediterranean as an integrated economic unit, the north would always be subsidiary. We would see a situation similar to what occurred in Asia in our timeline, in which China was the Jupiter with all the surrounding nations revolving around it. We would likely see a situation in Northern Europe similar to what occurred between China and the surrounding nations like Korea, Japan, Vietnam, etc., which all use alphabets, governments, and religions derived from the Chinese models, but also have their own independent native cultures. Likely several Northern European countries would be vassals to the Romans, bringing them homage and tribute. Northern Europe would have a greater tendency towards unity with the enormous great power to their south. Germany, for example, would remain a unified nation for its entire history due to the fear of the common Roman threat. The Northwest Europeans and peoples like the French, Germans, and Hungarians would look up to Roman civilization, but would also be great rivals. The Romans would deal with this by forming alliances in Eastern Europe. The Romans would try to use Poland and Russia as allies against the states further west in Europe. Like our timeline, with the Roman Empire as its greatest trading partner, Russia would take quite a bit of influence from Rome. Rome would be large enough that it could just swallow smaller groups that were capable of becoming pretty powerful in our timeline. For example, the Turks would be defeated by the much larger Roman Empire, and if they did break through to the frontier, would assimilate to Roman culture. This is similar to China, which assimilates barbarian invaders as a hobby. A serious misconception that people have about ancient Rome is that we view it as some paradise of technological progress. This is mostly since we're in awe of Roman architecture, which was their one point of advancement. However, for its 1,000 years, the Roman Empire saw almost no technological progress in any field. The counterpoint to this is that most people believe that medieval Europe was some den of decay and ignorance. The opposite is true. With the exception of the modern West, medieval Europe was one of the most inventive societies in history. In several hundred years, medieval Europe saw vast advances in agriculture, naval, economic, political, and military abilities, population size, and enormous intellectual advancements. The funny thing is that the Romans were very good administrators, but not terribly inventive, while medieval Europe was very inventive but were really bad administrators. Thus, it really annoys me when people say that in a world in which the Roman Empire never fell, technology would be more advanced. People are correlating how much education was valued in Roman society with technological progress, a correlation that just isn't there. For example, Confucian societies like Japan and China have and have had the largest respect for education, but were in a huge technological slump for nearly 1,000 years. Our timeline's Western civilization was so successful due to the internal competition inside it. In medieval Europe, power was so decentralized between the church, nobility, merchants, and monarchy that no one social class could gain power, so they all had to remain realistic and had to better themselves through competition. On a geopolitical level, the endless competition between different European powers created an atmosphere of military, technological, and political competition that Darwinianly brought out the best in each society. For example, science and capitalism. Capitalism was able to thrive in the West since no political force was capable of muzzling the merchants, and so the merchants were able to become politically powerful and continually grow their fortunes. Similarly, no central intellectual elite, whether like the Confucians in China or the priests in Islam or India, were capable of controlling intellectual discourse, which meant the West was able to search for the truth to a much greater degree. I've basically gotten rid of all these conditions. Rome would be very politically centralized, with a great degree of social centralization as well. A certain degree of competition would come from Persia and the North European kingdoms, but not enough to really justify the conditions that set Europe off in our timeline. Gunpowder would probably result in a decline of the empire for a century or two. The introduction of black powder from China would disproportionately benefit the North European states. These states would be closer to our timeline's European conditions than the Roman Empire. Also, nation-states universally do better with gunpowder warfare, since most large multi-ethnic empires tend to recruit their warriors from the elite or internal barbarian tribes while disenfranchising the peasantry. This doesn't work well with the large infantry armies needed for gunpowder, and this is why the Ottoman, Mughal, Qing, and Russian empires had trouble keeping up militarily with the Western powers, even though they had the technological abilities to do so. This is in fact the exact situation that occurred with the Ming dynasty not being able to keep up with Japan in the 16th century militarily. The Roman Empire would face a century or two of humiliation at Northern Europe's hands before being able to reform and deal with the issue. In general, the world would be several hundred years more technologically backwards in this timeline. Rome in this timeline is pretty similar to the giant empires Europe dealt with in the Age of Exploration, like the Chinese, Persians, Mughals, and Ottomans, that all had trouble modernizing. It's deeply unclear how much North Europe in this timeline would share with our timelines in Northern Europe, or how much it would be like Korea, Japan, or Vietnam. A mix is probably the most probable option. I guess it would be very ironic to those who lived through it, but the fall of Rome, or more accurately, Rome's inability to reform as an empire, could be seen as one of the greatest technological accelerators in history. Whatifalthist, and thank you for watching. Congratulations on finishing my longest video ever. At least, that is if you don't count my 7.5 hours of live streams. But if you like that video, please comment, like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more content. Alternatively, check out the awesome card game Forks in the Timeline, the link to which is in the description, or check out my Patreon where I've got cool maps in the first 3 chapters of my History of the World, or Check me up on Twitter. As always, thank you for watching and have a great day.